In this video, we're going to talk about the #1 biggest lie in hitting. And there was a question that came through, reader asked, ways to use your hips to create bat speed. Now in a later video, we'll talk about the difference between bat speed and ball exit speed. And in this one, we'll talk about bat speed. Three things we're going to talk about. One is the inward hip turn towards the catcher versus keeping the belly button parallel to the plate. That'll lead us into the Springy X Pattern, and then we're going to talk about landing open with the front foot and what angle that front foot needs to land at. Let's first start with the inward hip turn. Now, let's define that. What does that mean? So this is something that I was taught growing up through high school and college, was that power came from the hips, like everybody else. Fire the hips, load and explode the hips. So the inward hip turn was something like this. If the pitcher, when the pitcher showed his front pocket on his backside, then the hitter was taught to show their back pocket on their backside. This is something that you can watch Bryce Harper. Bryce Harper does this quite a bit. And there's a debate even amongst the my readers, hitting coaches and instructors that actually teach based on validated human movement science. And some of them like to have this head start with the hips, but you're going to see why I really don't like this, and I don't think it really adds anything. It's going to have to be up for tinker and testing using the ZEP app and some ball exit speed radar guns to really get to the bottom of it. But let's go into what that inward hip turn versus what parallel means, parallel with the hips. So the inward hip turn we talked about was inwardly rotating the hips closed. Again, was taught because they thought that getting a head start with the hips to turn, because most power people thought was in the hips. Now, the reason why I don't like that, and I would rather the hitter keep their hips in like a neutral position where they're not closed, they're not open, they're just in a neutral position. So belly button parallel to the plate, all the way from the float, fall, and even into landing. I don't really want that pelvis to rotate inside or away. So lefties being the same. So going clockwise for a righty load and then opening counterclockwise and reverse for the lefty. Now here's the reason. If you pick up the book by Tom Myers called Anatomy Trains, he talks about 8 different lines of fascial lines, which we've talked about in a prior video, is a cotton candy-like material that your bones and muscles float in. It's very springy, right? So we have these different lines that go throughout the body here. And we also have lines that go across the arms and the back, which we've talked about as well. So imagine that there's an X on my chest. That's why I call this the Springy X Pattern. So X here, one leg of the X, one leg of the X here, and they are connecting the opposite hip to the opposite shoulder. So for a right-handed hitter, the main important one to focus on is the left shoulder, right hip. Lefty, it's the opposite. As we're going this way, it's going to be right shoulder, left hip. And what happens when we properly load our springy fascia is we're going to see one leg of the X get shorter, which for a righty, we're tucking the front shoulder inside the front hip. So we should see this front shoulder leg of the X get shorter, and then the opposite leg of the X will actually get longer. And we'll talk about in a later video hiding the hands from the pitcher, and that's going to help to facilitate this leg of the X getting longer. The same X appears on the back, and it's just the opposite. So if my front shoulder needs, this leg of the X needs to get shorter when I load my springy tissue, then the same line on the back is going to get longer. They have opposing forces like yin and yang forces. So the reason why I don't like the inward turn towards the catcher with the pelvis is because if I keep turning my hips away from my front shoulder, then I'm continually having to chase, my front shoulder is having to continually chase my back hip, which, as you can see already, this is starting to close me off. Now I'm going to be starting from a too far wound up position, and I'm going to have a hard time getting to that inside pitch. It's a very subtle concept, and it's something that you'll hear throughout these videos, the Goldilocks golden rule. She didn't want it was too hot. She didn't want the porridge that was too cold. She wanted the one that was just right. So we can do this too much. Too much isn't good. We can do this not at all. We want the one that's just right. So I don't like my hitters to inward turn, because then the front shoulder's got to chase farther. I would rather keep the hips where they're at and just load the springy tissue this way. And most likely, if we'll talk about in a later video, if we're working on showing the numbers, which is basically what we're doing when we're tucking the front hip inside or front shoulder inside the front hip. If we're having a hard time getting inside pitches, probably what we're doing is inward turning, and that front shoulder just keeps chasing that back hip. The last thing I wanted to talk about was landing open with the front foot. Now, Xenolink, if you go on to YouTube and subscribe to Xenolink's videos, These guys have it down. They take the science, they look at the studies, they do the research, and they have it down to what is the average, the common denominator amongst elite hitters. And one of the things they found is that the landing foot lands at 65 degrees. So if this is 0, the foot, if we land closed, right? Most of us have this definition of closed, landing with the foot this way. If this is 0, straight at the pitcher is 90 degrees, we're talking about 65-degree angle with the foot. That's how open we want to be. And the reason for this is because when we land, we want that hip to be able to get ready to go. If it's closed, and I did an experiment, maybe I'll put this in the notes in the post, but I did an experiment where I featured Alex Gordon of the Kansas City Royals. It was in 2014 in World Series, and how he lands open versus, I can't remember the other hitter we were talking about, Carlos Perez, I think the catcher, who lands more closed. He actually strides closed, and it keeps the hips from opening. So if we're talking about creating bat speed, this actually, I did experiment in there, a ZEP experiment, and it decreased my bat speed, I think, by on average 3 miles per hour when I landed closed and tried to swing versus landing open and trying to swing. So in this video, we talked about the #1 biggest lie in hitting and answered the reader question of ways to use your hips to create bat speed. We talked about why inward turning towards the catcher just isn't as effective as just keeping the pelvis in a neutral or parallel position, belly button parallel to the plate from the float to the fall and into the landing position. We talked about the reason why has to do with the Springy X pattern, compressing the spring, taking one leg of the X and shortening it, and then the other leg of the X gets longer. And we talked about the relationship, the yin and yang relationship on the backside, the same X pattern. And then lastly, we ended with landing with an open front foot, and talked about how Xenolink, and they've done the research, and they've showed in that research that 65-degree angle is the minimum effective dosage of landing open. So we'll see you in the next video.
The Hitting Performance Lab wants to know, did you know repeatable hitting power does not start in the hips? Have you heard the expressions, load and explode the hips? Power comes from the hips. Well, we created a free video revealing the results of a scientific study that will show you how we added 48 feet of batted ball distance instantly. And it's not all about the hips. Click here now to get the video while it's still free.